This is about 6 million tons of plastic every year that leaks into the ocean. To give you an idea, this is the equivalent of 1 garbage truck per minute.
Just say that again. How much is going into the ocean?
1 garbage truck per minute.
Welcome to Radio Davos, the podcast from the World Economic Forum that looks at the biggest challenges and how we might solve them. This week I was hoping to bring you news of a global plastics treaty, but the UN negotiations in Busan, South Korea ended without an agreement.
Every day of delay is a day against humanity. Postponing negotiation, do not postpone the crisis.
I wasn't in Busan, but I have a colleague who was. Clemence Schmid, who runs the Global Plastics Action Partnership, tells us what happened and what happens next and how action against plastics pollution will not wait.
There's a lot of things that are happening. There's a lot of negotiation on commas and brackets, but there's also a lot of action that many stakeholders which have this will to see the glass half full and to really want to make a difference and a change are already bringing.
The glass is half full. The challenge is huge, but the will is strong.
We don't have to stay or remain a throwaway society. We can be a society that preserves resources, that actually care for it because we see the value of it.
Subscribe or follow Radio Davos wherever you get your podcasts, or visit wef.ch/podcasts, where you'll also find our sister programs Meet the Leader and Agenda Dialogues. I'm Robin Pomeroy, and with this readout from the Plastics Treaty talks.
Every minute.
This is Radio Davos.
Joining us to talk about plastics and the as yet unsuccessful negotiations to create a global treaty on plastics is someone who's just arrived back from those talks. It's my colleague, Clemence Schmid. Hi, Clemence, how are you?
Good, thank you.
Now, Clemence, you are director of the Global Plastics Action Partnership. What is that?
So the Global Plastic Action Partnership, or GPAP, is an initiative founded by the World Economic Forum together with multi-stakeholder partners across governments and private sector to fight plastic pollution and translate commitment into action at a national and global level.
So it's multi-stakeholder. Give us an idea of kind of who are the stakeholders in that?
So we're working with governments, obviously, at a national level. We're working with the private sector, meaning the companies, across value chain, meaning on different parts of the business. We're working with the civil society, with local communities in the case of plastic and waste management, the informal sector or the waste picker, which are the people that you would see in the streets picking up our trash.
Right, so really broad. This is what the forum does, isn't it? It brings together very disparate people who might otherwise not be talking to each other.
Absolutely. Different point of view, different starting point, and also each of them with an added value into the conversation.
Okay, let's talk about that conversation, which is about plastics. And plastics have been around, all our lives and probably a generation or two before. But only fairly recently, I think, as the general public really started to consider it a major kind of environmental problem. Could you give us some idea of what is the problem that's you're trying to solve here?
No, and I think you said it right. I think as a society as a whole, we've become kind of addicted to plastic, probably unintentionally. To give you a size, an idea of the magnitude, it's about 460 million tons of plastic which are produced every year. About half of that volume is designed to be used only one. We call this single-use or short-lived plastics. Think about the cup of water you might be taking at a dispenser just to drink a sip of water, and that would be discarded afterwards. And part of the problem that we are trying to address is currently only 9% of the plastic that we're using is being recycled, which means the vast majority of it is being discarded, so it's being wasted, and leaks into the environment. This is about 6 million tons of plastic every year that leaks into the ocean. To give you an idea, this is the equivalent of 1 garbage truck per minute. And when you're talking about leakage into land, this is twice that amount. So we're talking 2 garbage trucks per minute that end up into our environment instead of staying within the economy.
Just say that again. How much is going into the ocean of this leakage, as you call it?
one garbage truck per minute.
One garbage truck per minute. And this is a product, or these are products that hang around for a long, long time. It's not like they'll just be washed away somewhere.
Yes, plastic is one of those materials with many properties. Some of them are vital to the life that we're living today, but one of the disadvantages it has at what we call end of life, which is basically what happens after it's being used, is that it doesn't degrade like other materials. So plastic can stay up for over 1,000 years into the environment.
So let's talk about, you've just come back from, I believe, South Korea, where there was the fifth and final, in theory, it was meant to be the final negotiation. We've covered this process on Radio Davos. Listeners can go back. I did one, I think, before the negotiations started. I think I did another in the middle, around about the third of these 5 talks. And so we were hoping and expecting that by the 5th one, this was how it was all set up, there would be a draft treaty, a global treaty on what the world does about plastics. Could you give us an idea of what that treaty should have been, or still might be, if we're going to be optimistic in the future? What would it do?
So in 2022, at the United Nations Environmental Assembly, a wide majority of countries voted a resolution, which was brought by Peru and Rwanda together, to establish an internationally binding, legally binding instrument to end plastic pollution, including in the marine environment. This instrument, which is what we call the Plastic Treaty, was supposed to be negotiated in 2 years, establishing what we call the International Negotiating Committee, or INC, that would convene every 6 months, which is effectively what has happened since the end of 2022. And INC 5 in Busan, South Korea, should have been the last negotiation round for the treaty. What I think is also important is to understand into the multilateral context, how does this plays out? Because for us, it seems like meeting every 6 months and a 2 years process is very long. In the multilateral environment, it is not very long. There is a lot of steps and processes that needs to be followed. The United Nations operates on what we call a consensus base, which is 172 countries in that stage do need to agree on every single line, and every single dot, comma, and brackets do matter. For perspective, that treaty is probably one of the biggest negotiation at the international level, which is happening since the Rio conference, which happened in 1992. Which established what we know today as the COP. The most visible one is the climate COP. The one in Baku just finished. It was COP 29. 29 gives you the number of rounds of negotiation that those processes are going to go through. So you can imagine 5 rounds on something that was supposed to be legally binding. So something that is going to be enforced legally across every single countries, given their different national context, was extremely ambitious.
I'll come back to this idea of how effective, like the pros and cons of this kind of multilateral process in a moment. But let's just stay on plastics. What would this treaty do? I assume there'll be a limited ambition version which would do a few things, or a very wide-ranging treaty, and this is what the negotiations, I'm assuming, are about. Would it limit the production of plastics, the use of plastics? Would it govern the way plastics are disposed of? What kinds of things are most likely to be in that treaty that then countries would be expected, and companies and societies be expected to implement?
No, it's a great question, and I think where you're going at is what is the scope of the treaty, and that's actually one of the still contentious points when we're going deep into the negotiation, because I think what the UNEA resolution brought is this common understanding and this common willingness to end plastic pollution. So on the what, there's a lot of alignment. On the how we do this, this is where you start seeing the divergence. And we oppose, to be simplistic, what we call a waste management treaty, i.e. that will only take care of what's happening after we use the plastic. As I mentioned, only 9% is recycled. So there's probably things that we can do better as a society at large to actually retain that material into the economy. But there is another piece, which is what we call the full life cycle of plastic, which will take into account also the extraction, the production, the design of the product, on top of managing the waste part of it.
This INC5, this meeting in South Korea, did not result in a treaty being agreed. Why is that?
So because there is still a lot of divergence and the member states, the country couldn't agree on what will finally be the text. But before we call it a complete failure or a lack of success, I think it's really important to also share how the process has gone through and the progress that we've made. We started from a broad idea of ending plastic pollution, including in the marine environment, by 2040. It got us through the first 3 rounds of negotiation, where there's been a lot of question around what's the scope, what's the rule, how are we going to decide, should it be a full life cycle, should it be a waste management treaty, got us therefore into a text. After INC4, so the previous round of negotiation, the text that was brought forward by the INC was over 77 pages, almost 80 pages, I think, and over 4,000 brackets. In the world of multilateralism, brackets means it's not yet agreed. So you can imagine the amount of wording and sentences that were not agreed, including the scope of the treaty between a waste management and a full life cycle. And I think
so that's still not agreed then, whether this should be, we could have a treaty, it's about pollution. You could say we can produce as much as we like as long as we don't dump it in the sea or let it scatter around on the land. And I can imagine the kinds of stakeholders who might favour that. And then there's others who would say, no, we need to maybe even reduce the plastic we're producing in the first place. If you do that, there'll be less plastic around. You know, there's other things we can use instead or reuse lots of items. So it could, in fact, cover those things as well, right?
It is still one of the big contentious points. And I think one of the main reasons why we haven't yet a treaty out of Busan is to really finalize the alignment on how are we going to solve for plastic pollution. Although we got now to a text which is much more palatable, with articles which are much clearer. It's about 22 pages. And we focused on really the critical question that we still need to solve, or that member states still need to solve in the remaining of the process. So I think we've gone a long way from where we started.
So what happens now? Is there going to be an INC 6? Do we start again? What is it?
Yeah, so we don't call it yet an INC6. So in the terminology, the numbers talk about a session. So you need to close a session in order to reopen a new one. So the INC5 session hasn't closed officially. So what we will see now as a reconvening is not a 6, but what we call an INC 5.2. And that INC 5.2 will basically resume the negotiation to where they've been left off and agreed by the member state at INC 5, which is taking the text I was mentioning before, those 22 pages, and basically continue the negotiation.
And there's a date been set for that yet? Do you know?
No, yeah, we know it will happen in 2025. We are yet to know when exactly it will happen and where also those gathering will happen.
So coming to this from the outside as I am, and I've not read, the draft document with all its brackets in there. I've covered talks like this before, and I know exactly what you mean by this. This is suggested wording, which could be modified or deleted or whatever. Very complex, some of it quite arcane to the casual onlooker. I haven't seen that, but from what you've said to me, if you've not yet decided whether the scope of this covers the life cycle or just covers the end of life of plastics, it sounds like we're still a long way from a treaty that would actually have a real impact on the world. Am I right in thinking that, or am I wrong?
No, so I don't think we're far away. I think these are the exact tough question that we need to answer. So I'm really not surprised that this is going back and forth. And I think we're crystallizing the discussion on exactly the points, which is we, all of us as a society, as individual, consume a lot of plastic for very good reasons sometimes for probably something which is more convenience-based. And we all need to get to think about what are the plastics that are needed, what are the ones that we should keep using, what are the ones that can be potentially avoidable.
So what do you think might happen? Give us an imaginary scenario. A treaty is passed and then it comes into force at whatever moment. What might people, all of us use plastic all over the world, what differences might we notice? And what differences might companies notice in the way they operate?
So obviously it will depend on what the treaty covers, but I think no matter what it covers, it will have impact on our daily life and it will have impact on the way companies handle business. Some changes might be very visible also to the individual and to each of us. So for example, if we decided to ban certain elements, and some national regulation actually do it, you probably hear it, I'm French. French passed a regulation in 2023 banning single-use cutlery and usage in fast food, takeaway food. So
I've noticed in supermarkets as well in France, because I do cross the border to go shopping in France, and there's much less plastic than the fruit and vegetables area, for example. So things like that could spread. And other countries, interesting, you mentioned Rwanda is a player in this, and certainly certain countries in Africa were way ahead of the rest of the world in banning single-use plastic bags, weren't they? So these are things that a lot of countries maybe are already doing, but could spread more widely as a result of this treaty.
Could spread more widely, could be more uniform, and as such will also help. You were asking also from a company point of view, that will also help what are today global supply chains. Some of those changes will impact the product design. It is much simpler to handle if the regulations are harmonized at a global level.
And do you think we'll see that garbage truck that's tipping its full load into the ocean? Not literally, but that's the amount we're talking about, literally that amount. How often?
Every minute.
Every minute. Are we going to see that reduced because of this, do you think?
I think that's the reason why everyone is spending a lot of time and energy to negotiate a treaty, but also to change the way we operate in our daily life, whether it's us as individuals, whether it's companies, whether it's governments. That's the work that GPAP, which I'm leading, is intending to lead.
Clemence, I'm going to put two skeptical points to you now. I'm playing devil's advocate here because I would like to see the glass half full. But let's look at the multilateral thing as we saw before. As you mentioned, COP29 for the climate change thing, 29 of those things. It moves at such a slow pace. Greenhouse gas emissions aren't coming down in most parts of the world. It has to be all agreed by consensus. Some people, even people at the heart of the COP process, the climate COP process, have said in some ways it's not really fit for purpose and they want to see some changes to it. What do you think about the multilateral process? It's got huge weaknesses, but then again, you can't force any country to do anything. So I don't really see what the option is. What's your feeling about that whole process? You've had 5 of these meetings, you're going to have more. I'm sure there'll be more after that, even if a treaty is agreed. Is it glass half full, glass half empty? Strengths and weaknesses of that process?
Yeah, I think you have almost the answer into your question. It has strengths, it has weaknesses. The strength of it is once you agree something on consensus, it really works and it produces results. And I think one of the best examples in the multilateral agreement, which are put on the table, is the Montreal Protocol. You might recall it was talking about the depletion of the ozone layer. There was a lot of scientific fact. Countries came together, agreed relatively quickly in the world of multilateral agreement on solution banning certain substances, and we can now observe the ocean layers being healthy again, which is a proof that multilateralism can function. Obviously, when you expand that process into questions which are much more complex, we're touching not just one single sector, but across sector with interlinkages that we sometimes don't even completely understand. It makes the whole process much more complicated.
Yeah, the Montreal Protocol is often cited. It's the great hope for those of us who want to see the environment protected through multilateral processes. But it was much simpler, wasn't it? Because there were a handful of chemicals, the CFCs, the refrigerants, these industrial processes that were relatively easy, although it didn't seem it at the time, to replace. Then you've got climate change, which is literally countless. I don't suppose there's a scientist in the world who honestly knows all of the inputs that go into, the greenhouse effect. Maybe plastics is somewhere between the two in that it is very, very complex. There's not one plastic, there are many of them, many different uses, many different life cycles of plastic. It's not as simple as the ozone layer and the CFCs and all that. It's perhaps, I hope, not as intractable as climate change. Would you agree? It's somewhere in the middle, meaning that maybe there is hope this could really work for the plastics pollution.
No, I think you're really right. I always say plastic is very tangible. It's something that you touch, that you see. We're talking about, like a ton of plastic. You take a big scale, you can weigh it. It's much more concrete, and therefore the actions can be simpler. But to your point, it is also part of our everyday life. There is a lot of types of plastic. It's not just one thing. And it's also across multiple sectors. If we were to think, how often are we as individuals in contact with plastic, of what is called or defined as plastic? I'm sure a lot of us would be surprised in terms of how many types of plastics there is.
I mentioned I was going to put two skeptical points to you. Here's the other one. So when I go to that French supermarket, and it's like, oh, that's lovely. Now they've got brown paper bags for my weigh and pay apples or whatever instead of plastic, which was always thrown away before. I often wonder, and I wonder this a lot when it comes to plastics recycling, the consumer sees this, but is it really having an impact, or are we doing it more for performative reasons to reassure the consumer that they're doing something? But I'm sure plastics is being used on an industrial scale around the world, and whether I put my apples into a very thin, small plastic bag, does it really make that much difference? I wonder what your view on that is. And this treaty talk is so interesting because it brings together industrial producers, industrial users of plastics, for whom maybe Robin's plastic bag in the Leclerc supermarket is doesn't even weigh anything on the scales. Is there a worry that whatever is achieved in this treaty is a bit performative and it's just a bit to make us all feel a bit better about ourselves?
If I go back to what I shared at the beginning, out of the 460 million tons of plastic that is being produced, about half of that volume is designed to be single-use or short-lived. And this is Robin's plastic bag. As an example, all of the products that we're in contact with on a daily basis, sometimes several times a day. And I also want to say, in that garbage truck that we've been talking about, this is the bulk of that garbage truck, because it's something that you and I don't really value beyond the couple of seconds or the couple of minutes that we are using it. We don't value our plastic bag. It is just a mean to move our apples from the supermarket.
We're not buying the plastic bag, we're buying what's inside it. And the same goes for pretty much any packaging that's only used once. Right?
Exactly. And I think, therefore, this is this plastic that ends up afterwards leaking into the environment because it doesn't have a value. And I think also bringing back, and all of us, to think that the resources we're using, including the plastic bag, should have a value and needs to be valued as such by each one of us. It is not just something, it is not a talk between government, it doesn't have to be just a talk between companies or between the big industries. It's also from from a mindset point of view, we don't have to stay or remain a throwaway society. We can be a society that preserve resources, that actually care for it because we see the value of it.
So it is more than just for show. I'm delighted to hear that. Finally, you run the Global Plastics Action Partnership, GPAP, here at the World Economic Forum, bringing all those stakeholders together. What input can you have, what impetus can you give as GPAP or as the World Economic Forum, particularly as we are weeks now away from the annual meeting in Davos, where a lot of those big players are going to be meeting in Davos, talking about the big issues. This will be one of them, certainly. What is it that GPAP and the Forum can do to get these talks back on track, or if they're still on track, to push them forward to a successful conclusion?
GPAP existed before the treaty. We've been founded in 2018, and that was founded out of the realization that there is a huge need, that we do need to start thinking about how are we going to keep the plastic into our economies, and do this also in partnership with countries which are most in need. So countries which are developing economies and usually are lacking the basic infrastructure, which we're very lucky to see here in Switzerland, for example. And I think one of the strengths that from a World Economic Forum we have is being able to have that experience on the ground today, working with over 20 countries, experiencing that multi-stakeholder approach into the national reality, and be able to bring those insights and bring those learnings, not only just the talks, but also the action and what's happening up into the global scene to inform the negotiation, because there's a lot of things that are happening. There's a lot of negotiation on commas and brackets, but there's also a lot of action that many stakeholders which have this will to see the glass half full and to really want to make a difference and a change are already bringing. So how can we showcase already what's happening, bring the insight, and also spark the conversation on how can we ensure we give that enabling framework? How can we ensure we help innovation coming out of those treaties? Circular economy is an opportunity. We were talking about the changes before. We often approach change as being something negative, as being something that's going to have bad consequences. But change can be positive. Change can also spark opportunities, new job creation, improvement of a job creation. I don't want to make a too strong statement, but I would say any job is better than picking waste on a dump site.
Clemence Schmid, thanks very much for joining us on Radio Davos.
Thank you.
Find out more about the Global Plastics Action Partnership at globalplasticaction.org. The link is in the show notes to this episode. As the Forum's annual meeting in Davos is just weeks away, please make sure to follow Radio Davos wherever you get your podcasts to keep up with what's happening there. This episode of Radio Davos was reported and presented by me, Robin Pomeroy. Studio production was by Taz Kelleher. We'll be back very soon, but for now, thanks to you for listening, and goodbye.